Notice the last phrase of verse 7 of Romans chapter 13. And if we can read it in conjunction as the sentence would be read, render therefore to all their dues honor to whom honor is due. Today is the day, or actually this weekend, is the time that America sets aside to honor those who have fallen in battle. Of course, most of you who know your history recognize that this day was initially a day that the families of the Confederate veterans of the war between the states used to honor their fallen dead. They called it Decoration Day, in which they would go place flowers and things of that nature on the graves of the Confederate soldiers who had fallen in that great war. Of course, later on it was incorporated into the United States public ceremonies and holidays, and we know it today simply as Memorial Day. It is an honorable thing that men would be willing to give themselves a sacrifice for the freedoms and liberties of others. Our country was founded on the principle of self-sacrifice. I am so weary of the modern pundits referring to the American dream as meaning wealth, materialism, prosperity, etc. Ladies and gentlemen, that was not the American dream as envisioned by America's founders. Think about it. Most revolutions of history were instigated out of poverty and deprivation. They were led mostly by peasants. The old cliche of the pitchfork mentality, where men in desperation, because their families were starving, their jobs were lost, their properties absconded, and having no hope of recourse, took matters into their own hands and insurrected against their governments for the purpose of survival. Just trying to live, just trying to feed their families. And because of an oppressive, elite ruling class that hoarded all of the wealth and prosperity for itself, leaving the masses to starve to death, taxing them out of prosperity and out of desperation, they would rise up in revolution against those tyrannical governments. But my friends, that is not the history of the United States. That was not the motivation. The founders of our country were, for the most part, wealthy men. They were landowners. They were men of means. They were educated men. Many of them, if not most of them, with college degrees. Something quite unusual for the vast citizenry back in those days. And by the way, that was in a day when probably an 8th grade education was tantamount to a college education today. Many of the founders were knowledgeable in many languages. These were men of substance and wealth. They were men that had properties and esteem. They were not men that were starving. They were not men that were deprived. They were living, quote unquote, the American dream as it's defined today. But they were willing to surrender that. They were willing to give that up. They were willing to sacrifice their lands, properties, businesses, wealth, money, prestige, for something that they considered far greater. When you read our national birth certificate, which is the Declaration of Independence, of course, and you read the way they concluded that immortal document, they said that they pledged to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And they appealed to the God of heaven for the justification of their intentions. You see, they sacrificed those things. Many of the founders who were abundantly wealthy actually helped to finance the Revolutionary War and the Continental Army, an army that had no funding to speak of, and were a very meager army in terms of supply and equipment. And many of the wealthier of the founders actually gave of their personal monetary savings in order to purchase the equipment and tools that were necessary for the Continental Army to survive those initial battles. Does this sound like men who were wanting wealth and power and prestige? Does this sound like men who were driven by greed and by opulence and materialism? What were they willing to die for? And many of them did just that. What were they willing to surrender their properties for? And they did that. And their families, many of whom were dead by the time the war had ended. Why were they willing to sacrifice these things? It wasn't because of cars and houses, lands and properties. It was something much greater than all of that. They pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor so that their posterity, their children and grandchildren, even though they might die in the process and not ever realize the dream that burned in their heart, but they wanted their children and grandchildren to live in a land of freedom. Freedom, liberty was the American dream. A land where men could be free to worship God according to the dictates of one's heart, without fear of governmental pressure or harassment. Where men were free to work their jobs without governmental intervention. Where men and women were free to raise their children according to the values and the principles that God had given to their hearts. And you have no right, no power to make any ruling relative to the worship of God and the free exercise of religion. Congress shall have no power and when it comes to the right to keep and bear arms, the people will always have that right. And despite what you hear from the modern media and political gurus of the day, the Second Amendment was never about squirrel hunting or duck hunting. The Second Amendment, the purpose of it was always so that the people could retain to themselves the ability and the power to resist an oppressive central government. Humanly speaking, had it not been for the Second Amendment, America would have been slid into the the throes of tyranny many, many decades ago. Under God, it has been that liberty most that has protected the freedoms of the people such as they are. And on, those limitations were spelled out. And then at the end, the founders wanted to be clear that if there was anything that they had not actually incorporated by the pen into that document, they said in the 10th Amendment, oh, by the way, any and all powers and so forth that we have not placed in this Constitution, all of that, anything that we've not specifically described, anything that we've left out, all of that is reserved to the states and to the people. If we left it out, Mr. President, Mr. Congressman, Mr. Senator, Mr. Supreme Court Judge, if we left it out, it's none of your responsibility. It belongs to the states and to the people. And this nation was born. It was born in a baptism of blood, where men who had no boots and whose feet were exposed to the freezing temperatures at Valley Forge, where many had no muskets and many had no winter clothes, stood along those ramparts and through those trying, freezing days and nights stood guard over the American experiment. They stood on Bunker Hill and were slaughtered by the British. They stood at Lexington Green and resisted the Redcoats, and again at Concord Bridge as they attempted to arrest Sam Adams and John Hancock and seize the cache of arms that were stored at Concord. And the preacher, Jonas Clark, led his Minutemen, his male congregants, from the Church of Lexington onto Lexington Green. And they were the Minutemen, that congregation of Christian men with Jonas Clark out in front, their pastor. They were the men that fired the shot heard round the world. And they gave their lives for us, their posterity, so that we could be here today doing what we are doing. And from that time forward, those men and yes, women who have given their lives in the defense, and let me just pause and say, all lawful, moral war is defensive in nature. To defend liberty and freedom in these United States of America. Give honor to whom honor is due. But you know, the lives of those who have been lost in the preservation of liberty transcend uniform. What about the police officers who go to work every day to defend the laws and the liberties of their state or of their county or of their city, and who are killed in the line of duty? Are they not also worthy of our honor? The firemen? What about the lawful citizen who stands up against the forces of evil. And I understand when they talk about first responders. But I want you to be aware of something here, and I want you to be careful not to allow the media to define responsibility for you. Be very careful, because if you're not thinking, the National Press Corps, that's more rightly called the National Propaganda Corps, will redefine principles and definitions for you. First responders, we hear that a lot. I understand the connotation, but I want you to realize that the first responders are the moms and the dads, the citizens of the country. We are the first responders. The vast majority of criminal activity is thwarted before a policeman ever shows up or before he's even notified. According to those who have researched this particular subject thoroughly, they tell us that over 2 million times a year, 2 million times a year, a law-abiding, God-fearing American citizen defends his life or the lives of his family and property with his own personal firearm against evil men. 2 million times. Think about the lives that were saved, the rapes that were prevented, the wounds, the thievery, the menace. Think about the harm that was averted, and a policeman never showed up. Sometimes they were not even notified, didn't even know what happened. But a citizen who was willing to resist the evil force and who had the capability of doing so was able to defend his life, his wife, his children, his family, his friend, his neighbor against evil. We, the citizen, are the first responders. We are the first and the last line of defense against the forces of evil and tyranny, whether it be governmental or otherwise. We cannot depend on someone else to do for us what we are not willing to do for ourselves. And this notion that we cannot be secure except as the government secures us, and we cannot have peace except as the government procures it, or we cannot have prosperity except as the government provides it, is a lie of the socialist who seeks to destroy our liberties. So, we give honor to whom honor is due. And now that it's raining, I can just preach all morning. Because no one wants to go out in this weather. We give honor to whom honor is due. Do we honor the fallen men who fell advancing tyranny? Throughout the history of the world, there are men who, at the command of tyrants, invaded lands, pillaged, plundered, raped, murdered. Many of them died in the promulgation of tyranny. Do we honor them? Do we? We honor them not. We put no flowers on their graves. We play no music in their memory. We recognize them to be what they were, an evil force of oppression that deserved to be killed in the defense of liberty. But for those who die in the defense of freedom, to those who give their lives not in the quest of conquest, but in the defense of life, liberty, and property, we rightly give them honor. Ladies and gentlemen, America sits today in a very precarious predicament. We know our history, at least some of us do. We understand the principles upon which our nation was built. We come to this holiday and we honor those who allowed us the privilege, who, because of their sacrifice, allowed us the privilege to live in a land of liberty and of plenty. But here's the problem. Even as we honor those who have gone before us, we ourselves stand on the brink of oppression. The principles that our brave forebears fought and died to procure are being chipped away gradually and not so slowly anymore. We are surrendering by acquiescence. We are giving our freedoms and our liberties voluntarily. They're not coming at it with a spear and a sword, although they are doing that to some degree. But mostly, it is a volitional surrender. We are giving the enemy the chains that they are using to put around our own throats. We are giving them the rope that they are using to hang us with. We are supplying them with the tools of tyranny that they are using to enslave us with. We are voluntarily surrendering our freedoms and our independence. And make no mistake about it, without independence, there is no liberty. We seem to have forgotten that. Whenever that Jefferson wrote and the founders signed, it was called the Declaration of what? Independence. I actually heard a politician a few months ago reference the Declaration of Independence, and he said, and I wish I had the quote in front of me, could I give you a chapter and verse? But the essence, he said that we no longer have a Declaration of Independence, but now we have a declaration of interdependence. And that, of course, is the model of the Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission, United Nations, and other entities that seek to make America part of a regional or global governmental / economic entity, where America no longer acts for the interests of America, but now we must act at the behest of the United Nations or NATO or other international conglomerates. Our troops no longer march, in the eyes of many, for the independence and the autonomy of the United States, but for some kind of a supranational global economy, the international supply of oil, the international supply of economics. Has it dawned on you, ladies and gentlemen, that you cannot have a global economy if you do not have a global government to manage it? When you hear about the global economy, you ought to automatically remember, wait a minute, global government always follows a global economy. And that's what these international merchants desire. They desire an international government, where borders do not exist, where nationalities do not exist, where individual nation states do not exist. When America loses its independence, when we are no longer able to think, to act, and to serve upon the interests of the United States of America alone, we are no longer a free people. We give honor to whom honor is due. I honor those very few political personalities that are fighting the fight of freedom, that are actually serious about their oath of office. We honor them. But to those men and women of Congress, to those men and women of the executive branch and the judicial branch who are using the power of their office to steal our freedoms, our way of life, and our children's future, we honor them not. We resist them as we would resist Satan himself. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. And when we see the devil's work in politicians and judges and anyone else, we must resist them as much as we would resist a foreign force who would seek to strip our freedoms from us. Benjamin Franklin rightly said, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. He's right. We give honor to whom honor is due. Those men and women in uniform, the men and women out of uniform, the men and women of law enforcement, the men and women out of law enforcement, the men and women of our emergency corps, the men and women out of our emergency corps, the citizenry, those who understand the principles, the natural law, revealed law principles that God has, in His mercy and in His grace, allowed America to incorporate, and who are willing to fight and to defend those principles, we honor. We honor them. We thank God for them. Those who have already died, we revere them and we memorialize them. You know, I think it's important that before a man or a woman be asked to give his life for any cause, that he or she understand the cause for which they are asked to sacrifice. It's important that we understand the cause of freedom, the cause of liberty, the cause of national independence. And really, when you think about it, it's not for us. First of all, it's for God. Because God, it'd take me a month of Sundays to explain this, but God has glorified Himself through nations when there is justice, when there is freedom, and when there is peace. Those are the three great purposes that God desires to accomplish in and through governments. He has ordained government for those purposes. God is honored when justice is honored, when liberty and the principles of all of this is honored, and when peace is honored. Jesus is called the Prince of Peace. God wants to give peace to the heart of man. My peace I give unto you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. Not as the world giveth, give I unto you, but my peace. God desires justice. He desires freedom. He desires peace. And any nation that is willing to make the sacrifices that are necessary to procure justice and freedom and peace glorifies God, honors God. When we talk about honor to those to whom honor is due, the one that all honor eventually flows to is God Himself. God. God is honored when the nation advances justice. God is honored when a nation protects freedom. And God is honored when peace prevails in a land. And so it's not for us. It's first for Him. It's for His honor. But then, it's still not for us. It's for our children and our grandchildren. It's not about us. It's about God. And it's about our children. If the American people, and you don't have to have a majority, but you do have to have a tireless, indefatigable minority of freedom-loving, God-fearing citizens who are willing to die to preserve the principles of freedom for their children in order to do just that. And the first generation that comes along and says, give me money and not death. Give me success, but not death. Give me prosperity, anything but death. Give me security over death. Is the generation that will put the chains of slavery upon its own children, and is the generation that does insult and blasphemy to the God who gave them liberty. The only way to preserve freedom is the way the men and women did it that we honor today. It's the only way. It's the way Patrick Henry stated it when he stood in front of that convention and said, give me liberty or give me death. And we stand, we, the grandsons and granddaughters of these brave, many of them Christian patriots throughout the ages, who loved liberty more than they loved life itself, who wanted to honor God and preserve the principles of freedom for their children, that have given us this grand and noble legacy and heritage. On this Memorial Day weekend, as you enjoy maybe a picnic or a lunch or a time of relaxation, however you choose to do that, remember, we honor those to whom honor is due. But that's not enough, because we ourselves are required to be men and women of honor. We ourselves must be willing to pledge our lives and our fortunes and our sacred honor in whatever way that may mean, so that we too might bless and honor the God of heaven, who loves justice, freedom, and peace. And we might give such a land to our children.